Matthew 18:1-4 says, At that time the disciples came to Jesus and said, Who then is greatest in the kingdom of heaven? And he called a child to himself and set him before them and said, Truly I say to you, unless you are converted and become like children, you will not enter the kingdom of heaven. Whoever then humbles himself as this child, he is the greatest in the kingdom of heaven.
I wasn't a person who really loved to read when I was a child, but I loved the Guinness Book of World Records. Any of y'all like to look at stuff like that, the Guinness Book of World Records? You can kind of just Google stuff now. But used to, I had a big book that had the Guinness Book of World Records. It was awesome. You could look up the person with the longest fingernails. It was about 6 feet. You could actually look up the loudest female burp. Strange things, like close to 100 decibels. That's impressive. Who could eat the most hot dogs in 10 minutes? 75 last I looked. And then there's the person with the stretchiest skin. You've got the dog with the longest tongue. It's ridiculously long. It's very interesting, but it's completely unimportant. It doesn't, that's really neat, but so what, right? Then there's things, we don't care to imitate those things. But then there's the greatest kind of things that kind of matter to us, things that are important. People obsess still over the greatest of all times. Right now there's a big controversy. Is Michael Jordan or LeBron James the greatest NBA player of all time? And that gets people riled up. I mean, I see people still going, it's Jordan, it's still Jordan, out there. That's how it is. But I wasn't really that into baseball as a kid. I liked baseball and I liked to pitch. I liked to pitch a lot. That was my favorite. And my absolute favorite player, especially when I was younger, was Nolan Ryan. But I had about as much chance of being Batman as I do of throwing 100 miles an hour. So that was just off the list. I had to say, okay, that's the fastest. The greatest, I had to switch to Greg Maddux, the most accurate. So I would imitate him. I copied him. I did what I thought he did well, and I tried to do and imitate those same things and give it my best. That's what we do with the greatest that matters to us. And so the disciples, they go up to Jesus asking him, who is the greatest in the kingdom? I'm not sure they actually have the pure intentions that might suggest about learning and all these things. They're already arguing about who's the best. But Jesus absolutely stuns them in multiple ways throughout this entire series as he describes what it looks like to be great in the kingdom of heaven. Now, Jesus gives us models for greatness we can imitate. But before we look at our first example, when we were talking through this, we thought it would be advisable to clarify what the disciples are even saying they want to be the greatest in. We understand basketball, we understand being the greatest, all these other things. What is the kingdom of heaven? What is the kingdom of heaven? Now, I've described this in many other series, and it might just be new news to you. I hope it's old news to you, and some of it might be new news to you, though. But let's just define some helpful things. I'm not going to get exhaustive on it. The kingdom of heaven, first of all, for those who know their Bibles, is exactly the same thing as the kingdom of God in Mark and Luke and John. They're interchangeable wordings of the same thing. Matthew calls it the kingdom of heaven to emphasize its origin, where it's coming from. The Lord's Prayer, Matthew chapter 5, 6, all this whole section, the Sermon on the Mount, is about the kingdom. Here that he says, he wants to emphasize it. And in the middle of the prayer, the Lord's Prayer, he says, your kingdom come, your will be done on earth just as it is in heaven. In other words, it's been in heaven, right, this whole time, and it's invading earth. On earth as it is in heaven applies to kingdom come in that prayer. God's reign in heaven is invading earth. I've talked about that just a few times. If you've got these concepts and you just want to take a nap till I hit the next thing up there, I'll let you know. Not that anybody's doing that, just letting you know, some of you, I've covered this a lot of times. But Jesus is ushering in this, what has to be an expected kingdom. Like, he goes around and says, hey, the kingdom's coming, the kingdom's coming. Well, they expected something, why, where did they get this from, right? It goes all the way back. We have to connect ourselves. It's almost like if you read the Old Testament and you jump to the New, you go, where did this kingdom thing all of a sudden come from? It does come from the Old Testament. When Israel was conquered by Babylonians and went into exile, the prophets told that a forever kingdom with a king in the line of David would come. And so they've been anticipating that this king would come and kingdom. So as Jesus is preaching, he's already talking about how the kingdom is near, and some of it it's arriving. And the difficulty is that this kingdom had all kinds of philosophies develop around it in the years between the Old Testament and the New Testament, or you might say the exile and Jesus. So there were things that people got right about the kingdom in the New Testament, but a great deal of things people fundamentally misunderstood about it as well. Let's get a little bit of what the misunderstandings are. To summarize, I say the major skewed views of the kingdom when you're reading the New Testament really helps to understand this, is that people expected the Messiah to violently overthrow the world along with all its peoples, and then a Messiah, and so basically there'd be a violent overthrow of the world by the Messiah. The Messiah would then reign in person forever. You throw in, for most of them, like the Pharisees, you throw in some physical resurrection for Israel at some point, into being vague on purpose because there's a lot of different variants and beliefs. And then after that, there would be new creation, and forever kingdom would just go on forever with be us kind of like heaven, the same imaginings. That's what's in their heads. Some of that's right, some of that's wrong. The timing of it, how it would happen, is kind of skewed. The problem is that their ideas were not God's ideas. So when you're reading the New Testament, Jesus has to come and straighten them up as to what the kingdom actually is and how it works. The whole Sermon on the Mount is, well, the kingdom is like this, it's like that, it's like this, it's like that. It's like love your enemies, not eye for an eye. So he's constantly having to recorrect their understanding of the kingdom. Jesus would usher in a kingdom empowered by his Spirit, but he would die rather than conquer. He would resurrect physically himself while delaying physical resurrection for all his people and creation. Those things would come later. That's what we call the second coming. But the kingdom of God, this is, if you want to write something down, this might be what you write down. The kingdom of God is where God reigns. Not R-A-I-N-S, but rules, reigns. So when Jesus tells us about the kingdom, he isn't just telling us what heaven is like when we get there. That's not what when he says the kingdom of heaven is like, he's not saying this is what's going to be like when you get to heaven. He's saying that heaven is invading here, and he's expecting us to live in this kingdom way. So the whole power of heaven hasn't come and changed everything in the blink of an eye, right? We know that. We don't live in something that's as much like heaven as we want. Again, that's the second coming. So what do we do now? What is this that we're in? We as Christians and as the church are an expression of the kingdom through the Spirit. We are as we relate, as in ourselves and as we relate to one another, an expression of the kingdom. Now, the church isn't the kingdom. I'm being kind of specific on some things here, maybe a little technical for some of you, maybe it puts you to sleep, I know. But the church is an imperfect subset of the kingdom. The church, again, is not the kingdom. But it's important to understand the focus, love, dedication, and trust needed to take part in this local and very real expression of the kingdom. In other words, greatness or being like the kingdom matters if we're going to be in any way a reflection of who God is and what it's like to have him reign in his life. And I'm the first to tell you, we are an imperfect expression of the kingdom. But we're really supposed to be and do as best as we can to live that out here and now. I find this writing by a man named Carlo Corretto, his experience with the church, I think he's incredibly realistic. And why I think we really also need to take a look at the greatness of the kingdom of God. Because living kingdom life together is difficult, but it's also precious. And he says this. If you have your outline, it's on there. How baffling you are, O church, and yet how I love you. How you have made me suffer, and yet how much I owe you. I would like to see you destroyed, and yet I need your presence. You give me so much scandal, and yet you have made me understand what sanctity is. I have seen nothing in the world more devoted to obscurity, more compromised, more false, and yet I have touched nothing more pure, more generous, more beautiful. How often I have wanted to shut the doors of my face, my soul in your face, and how often I have prayed to die in the safety of your arms. It's a beautiful expression of those who've struggled through understanding the imperfect, what it means to be both imperfect, but so in love with what God's doing, and to deal with that difficulty. So where should we start? Basically, that becomes the question. And it's at the beginning, of course. Just basic. Y'all know Vince Lombardi? Raise your hands if you know Vince Lombardi. Just so I have a sense of, okay, not everybody knows Vince Lombardi. Vince Lombardi was one of the great coaches of the NFL of all time, mostly back in the 60s and 70s, winning championships and doing all these amazing things with the Green Bay Packers. And he would start every season, the legend is anyway, he would start every season surrounded by these professionals, even Super Bowl winners, by holding up a football and saying, gentlemen, this is a football. Starting right there in front of all of them. This is kind of a common thing for great coaches. Another coach named John Wooten was the basketball coach at UCLA, again around the same era, and he was at national championships all over the place. I mean, incredible number of championships. And he would start each year by having all of his players get together in the locker room, and he would teach them how to put their socks on right so they didn't get blisters. The disciples are asking, who is the greatest? They want to know the pinnacle, right? What's the secret sauce to life? And Jesus calls a child and says, unless you become like this child, you will not even enter the kingdom of God. Boom! They want to know like the secret, like how to be the most successful thing ever. And Jesus is like, no, we're going to start at the beginning. You need to go all the way back to the very beginning of this conversation. All the way back to the fundamentals. But unlike Lombardi or John Wooten, he isn't just starting there and going back the same direction. He says you got to go back there so you can start all over again and go the opposite direction. Because you have to relearn, he says, basically, everything that you've thought about greatness. You have to relearn everything you thought about how this game was played. They hadn't even started, and they're worried about greatness. I love those kind of things when he smacks them and us in the face when he says these things. It goes back again to the kingdom confusion I was talking about a minute ago. We all know that kingdoms have hierarchies, they have structures, they have people on top and people on the bottom. That's what kingdoms generally were always imagined as. There's no exception to that. They want to know if they're on top. Peter had just been, and James and John had just been on the Mount of Transfiguration, invited there. The three of them must have thought they were great, right? Peter even got told, you are the rock, and on this rock I will build my church. He must have thought he was the greatest. So who's the greatest? And they're all sitting there waiting for an answer, and Jesus pulls up this boy. This is where, before you can even start to talk about greatest, you have to go back to this little child. And Jesus mentioned at the end of chapter 17 that he's about to die. He says, I'm going to die, be raised again in 3 days. And so you might think this is a really strange question to follow. Hey, I'm about to die. Oh, really? Who's the greatest? Strange turnover there. But you might remember, and I have to go back, I'm getting nerdy, Alexander the Great. Alexander the Great is someone everyone in that ancient world knew. And when Alexander the Great died, it was his closest friends, his greatest generals that took over. Ptolemy, Seleucus, Cassander, the greatest of this kingdom that took over. So if he's going to die, they want to know if they're going to be Ptolemy. You know, they're going to be those next kings to kind of take over the kingdom. And the disciples, and then that's one way of thinking. That's kind of the general, I don't mean that they actually think they're going to be Ptolemy or something, but that's the general nature of thinking. And the disciples, they're just jockeying for power. But Jesus inverts what greatness looks like, doesn't he? When he calls up this child and says, you got to go back. You've got to go back to the powerless, to the humble, to the servant situation of a child. He just inverts everything. Everything they've imagined about how power and greatness works, he's turned it completely and utterly upside down. Children didn't have rights, position, or rank. They were to be seen and not heard in ways that we couldn't even imagine really today. The starting point is the humility of a child. And I know when he pulls up a child in Mark and other places, it's the faith of a child or it's the trust of a child. Matthew is very specifically pointing out humility for us. So the other things are true about faith and trust and those things in Mark, and that's what they're emphasizing. Matthew's emphasizing humility. So that all their positioning, their accomplishments, their achievements are what they want Jesus to base their answer upon. The disciples would have never considered how they treated that child that was also around them to have anything to do with their greatness. But the greatest grabs the child. The greatest in the kingdom himself, grabs the child and says, you want to know what greatness looks like? It looks like this. You need to go back to the starting line. You need to reposition your life because you should never overlook anyone, which is the baseline of humility. Humility doesn't mean thinking you're worthless. I've had people say that kind of thing. Humility is not self-hatred, but humility is thinking about others. Humility is putting others in front. It's giving up on the idea that you're the one who determines worth. It's several things. We could talk about it for a while. It stops thinking of others as tools to build my kingdom. The irony is that if you start worrying about your purpose, your greatness, your calling in God's kingdom to a great extent, you'll start to step on people. You'll start to crush them yourself. In other words, they're not looking at who's around them. They don't care what they got to step in. They want to be the greatest in the kingdom. And they're going to do that's how you got up into a kingdom. You stepped on people, you got over them, you used them to climb. Jesus is like, no, this is the pathway, not your step. Oh Lord, it's hard to be humble when everyone's in my way. Y'all know the old song. I changed it just a little bit. If you don't know, it's, oh Lord, it's hard to be humble when you're perfect in every way. It's a funny joke. But when everyone is in my way, it's pretty much our culture today. If you look for advice today, what do you hear? You're having a hard time. I hear this. Believe in yourself. What you really got to do is focus on what you need to do. If you're in maybe business, you need to increase your market recognition. It could be true for a church too. To get to the top, you have to hyper-focus on your goals and don't let anything or anyone else stop you. If anything is wrong in life, the problem really is that you weren't focusing on yourself enough, right? Hear that a lot. You have to sometimes get it in the subtle hints of advertisements or shows. You don't love yourself enough. Or you really need to listen to your heart. Heart's a dangerous thing. I'd be humble if so many people didn't hold me down. That's kind of our logic. If people weren't in my way, if I had an easy trajectory to the top, maybe then I could be humble, but I've got to prove myself. I've got to have everything in line. I've got to achieve. I've got to get to the top, and I've got to do what I got to get there. But there's people in my way who get in my way, and it makes life so hard. And we talk about balance in life. Everyone talks about balance in life, but we reward obsession. We reward people who are obsessed with one thing. How did we get here? You know, there's a philosopher I kind of like, but I think he has at least one really good point. He's a Korean-German philosopher. Last name is Hans. That's right, Korean-German. But he made a really interesting observation to me. He said, our society has rejected defining our culture by taboos and by external forces. He says, I'm actually lowering the big words here, to determine meaning and identity. You see, for centuries, the status in which you were born really determined the status that you had for life. You kept it. You did this job, your dad did this job, you were going to do that job. You were in this kind of sort of income, you were almost absolutely going to stay in that particular income. And that's great. We like the idea that we can move upward. I mean, the freedom is wonderful and it's great. But it was mostly back then an I can't culture. You were defined by these external forces. And we switched over what you call a restrictive culture to a freedom I can culture. But we were not very careful with our I can. In other words, we weren't very careful and thoughtful with our freedom, because I can destroy myself with my freedom. We could destroy ourselves with freedom. Freedom without virtue is foolishness. I can, which is what we're living in, is all internal. We get to form who we are, but when there's no ceiling for where you can go, there's often no real success. There's no status point where you say, okay, I've achieved in life a satisfactory point for this economic area or this particular area of life. And so there's always something inside of yourself saying, you don't mean as much as you could if I did this more. If I just pushed harder. If I just did a little bit more, my life would mean more. People think that. We are told you can achieve anything you want to if you work hard enough. That's baloney. It really is. There's things I can't do. And the obvious one is I'll never be Michael Jordan or Nolan Ryan, but there's a lot of other things in life I'll never do. And if I choose to work and put all my obsessions in one bucket, I will be really, really impoverished in other areas of life. If there is any reason someone fails, the solution is what? You need to work harder. You need to aim higher. You need to work more. And this isn't something that everyone's necessarily telling you. This is what you bought yourself. These are things you're telling yourself generally. Yes, the people say it out there, but we internalize it and say, I need more. But freedom destroys the foolish. So now we aren't exploited by some master of the universe or some great king who tells everybody what to do with direct commands, but we are controlled by trying to keep up with the Joneses. Raising the GDP in a mad dash to greatness. I can is so important that we don't stop to ask if we should. If the road is really going somewhere, or the greatness that we're thinking we're going to achieve in life is really, in meaning of life, is more akin to the guy pulling the skin off the side of his face. I mean, that's funny and strange and weird, but it doesn't mean that. It doesn't mean anything. It's unimportant. And a lot of our life are spent for greatness to get in some weird category of greatness in our life. Where is the greatness that you're looking at in life? We're all funneled right now into this I can burnout culture because we become slaves to I can, therefore I must, and oh, I will. I'm going to do it. I can. I will. And everything else, that's kind of the thing, that pursuit of that greatness can very easily take over our lives and burn us out because there's never an end to it. And Jesus says, I think to us today, turn around, or that word convert in some of our translations, go back and be like this child. In total freedom, surrender the I can culture that tells you how you're valued and how you're worthwhile. Go back, reevaluate your obsessions, your kingdoms, your I can. Has your I can taken over your life? Just to prove that you can? To the world, to yourself, to someone else? Who are you trying to prove your life to? A lot of people get stuck in the I can culture. Now, it was just Groundhog Day this last week. One of my absolute favorite movies is based on Groundhog Day. It's been for years one of my favorite movies, so you'll have to excuse me if I've mentioned it before. But Bill Murray, the famous comedian, plays a guy named Phil Connors, covering Groundhog Day in Pennsylvania, and he has this terrible attitude, right? He's just sour, he's nasty, he's mean. And the groundhog, now you might also note, he is also named Phil, Punxsutawney Phil, if I'm saying the name of the town right. Phil, the groundhog, sees his shadow, and winter is going to keep coming. He goes back into his cave, right? He's focused on himself. He sees his shadow. He goes back in. Meanwhile, Phil Connors gets stuck in a time loop because he, like the groundhog Phil, is totally focused on himself. And every time he sees himself, and it's all about him, he goes back into the cave. He goes back to the beginning. And he's just stuck in this entire loop. After some mischievous days, Phil Connors, he starts trying to figure out how to get out of it. Like, how do I get out of this time loop? And he displays the absolute perfect I can culture. He tries being nice to everyone. He tries to be brave and save people. He tries learning a piano, ice sculpting, and learning all kinds of skills because he still thinks it's really about his achievement for him to get out of it, right? But it's never enough. By the end of that point, he's just burning out. He's like, I've tried everything. The reason he can't escape is because he's always looking at himself. He's always focused on the solution to his life problem is him. It's some kind of self-help, self-improvement. The only way that we find by the end of the movie, and I hope I'm not giving it away for you, it's only been out since 1993. The only way for him is to get out of it is to surrender and realize someone else in his life is more important than he is. His career or his achievements. That person is more important than any of those things. Of course, it's a sappy love ending because it's a Hollywood story, but the point's the same. You got to go back again to the very beginning, like a child, and realize that the path to true freedom, true greatness as a human being is not through I can. It's not through achievement. It's through total surrender. It is through echoing the greatest childlike humility that the world has ever known. As Jesus prepared for the cross, he prayed in the garden this very basic childlike prayer of humility. Not my will, but thine. Not my will, but yours, Father. He looked away from himself and he looked at each one of you and he looked at us. All of us. Each one of you here this morning, he looked across the world and he said, I'm going to accept that cross. And when he accepted that cross, he also accepted full life and resurrection to follow. And he chose new creation, and all of life poured out of this humility that it's not about him. That is greatness. That is abundant life. That is the fullness that so many people are wrecking their lives trying to find. Should you work hard? Absolutely. But it's not everything. One thing to remember, getting rid of the destructive I can culture does not become some sentimental God can culture. It's true, God can, but it doesn't just shift over from I can to God can without one very, very important conversion in your life. Greatness in the kingdom is about whose kingdom? His kingdom. When you accept Jesus and you say, God, I surrender to you, you're not surrendering so that God can build your kingdom. If you don't make that transition with it, it'll just keep burning away. Because it's about who is the greatest in his kingdom. So become a child of the King. King Jesus is the greatest in the kingdom. Do you keep going back again and again to the same burnout? Are you finding the same cycle of pain, hope, frustration? Jesus is saying, you need to be God's child. You need to be a child of God himself. Humble yourself before the Lord and take on the great and still difficult life of faith. What you will find in your life is a story that is really going somewhere. It's changing your life. It's changing others for eternity. Do you need to go back to the beginning this morning? Do you need to rediscover what grace and greatness in the kingdom looks like, feels like? Can you pray that very beginning of the prayer? Our Father, who art in heaven, for me, King James, who is in heaven, let your name be made holy. May your kingdom come. May your will be done on earth as it is in heaven. Jesus is offering you that chance this morning. I'll be down at the front to pray with you. Maybe you're burned out. Maybe you're tired. Maybe you've tried your way 1,000 times. Just like on Groundhog Day, you just keep trying, keep plugging in a little different nuance. It's time to surrender. Surrender to the King who loves you and cares for you and will give you hope and give you life.